welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we return to our theme on the changing politics of protest. Over recent months, London has been regularly ground to a halt by vigorous protests on first a People's Vote, then on the climate emergency, and most recently against the state visit of President Trump. In today's show, we look at how protest campaigns have evolved over the last century by contrasting the near revolutionary events of a century ago in working class Glasgow, campaigning for better working conditions, with today's essentially middle class protest in London against HS2. They took to the streets in Glasgow, they take to theatrical boards in London. Before that though, to Alex with your tweets, messages and emails on his all-time hero, Robert the Bruce.
Now, it'd be fair to say that our interview with Robert the Bruce actor Angus McFadyen proved a hit at our very own box office. 240,000 views on Facebook page and climbing, a record for the Alex Salmond Show. Now, what you had to say about it was this. Arthur said, really enjoyed the interview with Angus McFadyen. I foresee film, TV and the arts blossoming in an independent Scotland. There are so many stories about our past and contemporary history just waiting to be told. And 3D Animation says, interesting approach to the spider scene. Reminded me of Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now. Ali B said, well, Alec, anywhere north of Dundee won't get to see it because Cineworld's not showing it. And that was repeated by Terry, who said, please screen this film in Aberdeen's. However, the National earlier this week contained the great news. Cineworld U-turn on Robert the Bruce film, because such was the online clamour to see the film that Cineworld decided to show it after all. And Angus McFadyen confirmed this. The Bruce will be seen in 5 cinemas, including Cineworld Aberdeen, I have been informed. So it just shows you that the public demand and the box office hit the Alex Salmond Show can have a considerable effect.
100 years ago, working class Scotland erupted in a protest which the government of the day feared would develop into a Bolshevik revolution. Alex takes up the story with former Scottish Justice Secretary Kenny MacAskill, who's published a book on the extraordinary events of Glasgow 1919.
In 1917, Russia fell to the Red Revolution. In 1918, the German High Fleet mutinied at Kiel, helping to end the First World War. But in 1919, was Glasgow close to a Bolshevik revolution? Certainly that was the view of the then Secretary of State for Scotland. And former Scottish Justice Minister Kenny MacAskill has written a book about it. So how close was Glasgow 100 years ago to leading a revolution?
Well, I don't think there was ever going to be a Bolshevik revolution, but it was certainly a maelstrom. And I have to say, in researching the book, I came to the conclusion, how we tend to think every Armistice Day that when the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world must have been very peaceful. And it was far from that, because in January 1919 there was war going on as the Bolshevik revolution was fighting for its very survival, with Allied armies attacking Russia and Russia attacking Poland. Ireland had just seen the return of a Sinn Féin majority. The Dáil had been established and the War of Independence was about to break out. Overhanging all that, the great Spanish flu pandemic was coming in. And finally, as demobbed soldiers were going home, the spectre of mass unemployment in a community that was already ridden with poverty was frightening people who had realised what had gone before. So it wasn't peaceful times in 1919. It was very stressful, radical times, which is what resulted in 10,000 soldiers on the streets of Glasgow, guns being paraded in, and tanks being paraded in the centre of
So we actually had tanks mobilised by the government into George Square?
Tanks were brought up the following day. 10,000 soldiers were brought from all across Scotland to prevent basically the situation escalating. There had been a major, the strike had been ongoing all week and crowds had been gathering. And then, as often happens, there was no real reason why there was a tumult in a crowd. And it can best be described as a police riot. The police attacked the crowd, but when the crowd was 20,000, rising to 40,000 and beyond, and many of them were ex-servicemen, they turned, and it would be fair to say, bettered the police.
So this was a demonstration about an ongoing industrial dispute in George Square in Glasgow, right outside the city chambers. which developed into quite literally a riot, because the Riot Act was read, or attempted at least to be read. There were mass baton charges by the police on the crowd, and then charges by the crowd on the police. There were members of Parliament caught up in the fracas. There were blood and gore everywhere. How on earth could such a thing happen?
Well, it had been planned for. The War Cabinet had been meeting, the troops had been ready, the tanks were prepared, because they had been worried about the scale of the industrial action. Because this was a strike that had started with limited support, but it was taking off in the days when you could still have flying pickets and when industrial sites were next to each other and employed tens of thousands. People were coming out of work in the engineering works in Glasgow, and there was huge concern.
So the aim of the industrial action was for a 40-hour week, which in these days was a pretty radical demand.
Well, it's, I think in the days in which we work, when people are living in this so-called gig economy and people would bite your hand off for a 40-hour week, it's strange to think that that's what the strike was for. It wasn't for an improvement in wages, it was for a 40-hour week, and that wasn't so that they could get more leisure time. Because they realised that there were millions of soldiers being demobilised who were coming back and wanted their jobs. And these people had lived through mass unemployment and the poverty and hunger that went with it. So they originally at one stage had been a suggestion of a 32-hour week, but it was a 40-hour week to spread the burden, get people into work, and it was taking off. There was a strike not just in Glasgow, Belfast, elsewhere in England, but Glasgow was probably the very epicentre, and that's why the troops were readied, because there was militancy in the air as strikes were threatened all across Britain.
The Secretary of State's description of the organised campaign of being a Bolshevik revolution or an attempted revolution, presumably that was to smear the demonstrators, but he wasn't without some foundation, because this was a highly organised campaign.
Well, before the Communist Party had been led, you could say it was communist-led. Many of the people running it were what was called the Clyde Workers' Committee. They were British Socialist Party, some of whom went into the Labour Party, but most actually ended up in the Communist Party of Great Britain that would be formed several years later. Willie Gallagher becoming the MP, Arthur McManus, the only, I think, Briton and Scot to be interred in the walls of the Kremlin. They were there. They were industrial militants and had been deported from Glasgow, and some had been jailed during the war for industrial militancy. So there was a clear threat. It was perceived as Bolshevik because there was great support for it. And indeed, I think we shouldn't underestimate the concern that the authorities had, because after all, Glasgow troops were confined to barracks, locked in at Maryhill.
That would be the Highland Light Infantry.
It was the HLI.
That was the Glasgow Regiment, wasn't it?
And indeed,
so they weren't to be on the streets with their guns in case they pointed in the wrong direction.
They were locked in and not allowed out. And all across Scotland, those from the west of Scotland were lined up and told to stand down because they didn't trust them to actually turn their guns on their fellow citizens. I think it was always unlikely that it would have spread beyond that. But the scale of the strike was significant, and I think what's often forgotten, and I tried to get across in the book, the strike was lost. People went back. But actually, within a very short space of time, you had an election in 1922 when the Independent Labour Party, which was left-wing and more distinct than the Labour Party, swept home, winning 10 out of 15 seats in the city of Glasgow.
Because when we're used to thinking about the Labour Party as a fairly monolithic unit, albeit with some still remaining Labour co-op members, we don't realise then that there was much more diversity within the Labour movement. And when it comes to electoral politics, there was people standing for the Labour Party, people standing Labour co-op, people standing for the Independent Labour Party, people even standing as communists with Labour Party support. So it was much more diverse in the electoral sense. And how were these various groups competing for influence in the industrial struggle?
Well, 1918 was the first time when we had an election on the more modern universal franchise. People often forget that many of these young men that went away to get slaughtered in the fields of Flanders had been denied the right to vote and had had no say in the election and the government that put them into war. 1918 was the first time when there'd been an election on the full franchise for men. not yet for women. And that was to change. And also that changed politics, because up until then the Labour movement in Glasgow had been much more wider, been much more of a social thing. There was everything from socialist Sunday schools through to socialist choirs. It became much more focused on political parties. And two main threads came through, the Communist Party and the ILP, because to some extent Glasgow was primarily an ILP city. Ultimately merged in the main with the Labour Party, but it was distinct. It was much more Scottish, very much rooted in Scotland, and much more left-wing than the mainstream Labour Party.
So how about some of these big personalities who became household names in Scottish politics and 3 years later swept into many constituencies in the 1922 election? How were they placed in this riot in George Square?
Well, many of them were there, and I think it's also important, and what I hadn't realised when I started out the research, the industrial workers were vital. But what was just as, and probably arguably more important, was what had been happening in the community, because when the men were fighting in the engineering works and the shipyards for the right to work and for the right to better pay and conditions and reduced hours, women were opposing rent evictions, rent rises and evictions, and that was driven primarily by women, because the men were away.
Mary statue was recently unveiled.
Absolutely, long overdue that a statue should be unveiled to her. And in many ways, that was more important because they generated in the community and reverberated there. So Glasgow was a tumult during the war, not just in terms of what was happening in the factories, but was happening in the communities, because rent restrictions and rent laws for the whole of the UK were brought in because of the pressure that happened in Glasgow, where the women organised rent strikes, opposed evictions, demonstrations took place, and to some extent, before even the problem in the January 1919 with the strike, what had worried the government most was the coalescing of the women in the communities with the men in the factories.
How many Scottish school kids, if you said, well, a school child in Glasgow today, if you said 100 years ago in your city, there was almost a Bolshevik revolution, how many would know what on earth you were talking about?
Oh, it's tragic. We don't know our own history, and that's come about by design, not by accident. The other thing, if you'll indulge me, I remember, and I hadn't realised it because we've gone through all these celebrations of World War I, but I never saw mention that in June 1917, Lloyd George, who'd become the Prime Minister a few months before, was to be given the freedom of the city of Glasgow. And they invited him up, and the demonstrations against him were to such an extent that to be able to speak, he required a military escort to get to the hall because crowds were chasing him around stations in Glasgow. This was the second city of the British Empire that was important, the most important city in terms of munitions for the British Army in its fight. And the Prime Minister was hostilely, opposed by thousands,
and
tens
himself
of
a great
thousands
radical politician.
Absolutely. And as I say, nobody told us that the opposition, as well as the support for the war that existed, but our radical history is there to be untold, and there's a lot more to come out. So I'm glad to have played my part along with others.
Well, certainly you've made a vital contribution. Thank you very much, Kenny McCaskill.
Join us after the break, when we'll contrast the campaign of 100 years ago with an enduring modern protest, the persistent attempt to stop the HS2 project. We'll see you then. Welcome back. The campaign against the HS2 fast rail line has been running since the realisation that many communities would be greatly impacted by the huge building works involved. In previous shows, we've examined the campaign at grassroots level. Alex invited some of the campaigners back to the studio to discuss the new techniques they've deployed and whether, with huge project cost rises and current political debates, they just might be within touching distance of success.
Jo and Dan, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Now, you've been part of the Stop HS2 coalition, but you've both been engaged in quite a different type of protest, using art as a means of getting your message across. I mean, so obviously, when did you start this, Jo, and what impact are you having?
Well, I think we are having some impact at doing protest art. We started out putting scarves on trees, so that was our very first art that we were doing. hand-knitted scarves that people had made locally, and we put them on the trees with a little sign that said, this tree is going to be cut down, and the reason why was because of HS2. And so people understood what was going to happen in the area, where a lot of people had no clue. So we, even after a few years, we'd be putting things up and people would say, oh, I didn't know, I didn't realise.
So that was, you think, more effective than, a leaflet round?
Yeah, people tend to just throw leaflets away, or they don't want to know, or so many people are giving out leaflets. I mean, we have tried that as well over the years, but we have found that the scarves are more important because people were taking pictures, putting them on Twitter, or even if the labels had fallen off that said why they were there, people were saying, oh, what's this about? And putting that on Twitter, on social media, and it was getting some publicity. So that was the start of it.
Now, Dan, you've been almost an artist in residence for some years now in the HS2 protests, particularly in London. What's been your most effective piece of artistic communication?
Well, much like what Joe is describing here, I think what we needed, what every campaign needs like this, is something which locates it visually and connecting imagery with the site of the HS2 campaign, which for us was this Euston Park Gardens immediately outside the station. So our campaign, or particularly my involvement, was very focused on that area of land.
This is effectively a green belt area under threat because of the HS2 construction.
That's right. It happens to be on the most polluted road in Europe and the only stretch of parkland, which is small and modest, but it has a huge amount of footfall and people use it, and it's a little mini oasis in a very busy part of London.
And how about the kind of wider argument? Maybe the HS2 proponents would have said, look, we're building a railway. This will get people off the roads and stop polluting the place. Can't you take a bit of loss of green belt to achieve this project?
Well, in this particular case, I mean, that's a microcosm of the green belt that was going to be absorbed by HS2 because they were going to, they still plan to remove it to create this temporary taxi rank. Now, a park historically which has been there for over 300 years, to be axed for the sake of a temporary taxi rank seems to me very careless and not particularly thinking about big pictures, really. I think this is something which could have been very easily avoided.
Joe, I'm interested in how you come up with your ideas. I mean, do you have a kind of collective to come forward with the next initiative?
I think everything is very organic, actually. So there'll be like one person in the community will think of something, and that's how we'll start. I mean, with the play at the Camden People's Theatre, I've been involved with them since 2012 when I first went in and asked them if they would like to have a table at our community fun day, which was called Restrain the Train, and that was about showing people about HS2. And that was in the first park that we lost, which was St James Gardens. Beautiful, beautiful place, huge trees. And since then, the artistic director, Brian Logan, has come to every little protest that there's been and, was being very involved with things locally. And the Camden People's Theatre is just around the corner from St James Gardens. He's brought back to life one of the dead from St James Gardens, a revolutionary figure, Thomas Spence.
I remember the campaign about all the bodies which were being disinterred from this historic... Was this one of the characters,
yes,
as it were, who's being unfairly and unseemly removed from,
yes,
from his resting place?
HS2 are saying now that there's 63,000 bodies buried
63,000?
63,000, which is a little bit more than we thought.
If it's not too gruesome, I thought, where are they going to go?
Well, that's the problem. We still don't know. And as far as I know, the vicar of St Pancras, who has care for the souls of the dead, she still hasn't been told. So we are concerned about that.
And legally, I mean, can HS2 just sort of, bulldoze through graveyards effectively? Is there not kind of hallowed ground or sanctity or protection or things like that?
No, we wish that it was. I mean, the church did petition Parliament, as did lots of us individually, about this, but once they've got the bill went through, so that it's under the Act, they can do what they like, basically. So,
and of course, there's been another issue about religion and hallowed ground that's been quite important as part of your protest.
Yeah, so St Pancras Church, which is just across the road from Euston Station, since they've cut down the trees on half of Euston Square Gardens and tarmacked it over, and cut down the trees in St James Gardens just round the corner, the crypt Euston Station now getting very, very damp. We think that the water table is rising, and part of the basement of the church has got water in it all the time. So we think that the cutting down of the trees is causing this problem for the church.
That's an unintended consequence of
Yes.
the removal of the trees.
Yes, absolutely.
And people watching this will say, that's really inventive. Love to go and see the show, love the artistic endeavour. Question is, does it work? Can you claim any success from these years of innovative campaigning?
Well, before I was involved with the HS2 campaign, I was invited by a man called Rob McBride, who's involved in the campaign in Sheffield, where there's a much, much greater exodus of trees being cut down from the city. I was asked to go and sort of visualise some of the trees, give them personalities, and I did these portraits of a selection of them, and we organised a great big paint-out day for hundreds of people who took part. So that campaign went on for 2 years. And they've stopped it. They're not going to cut the trees down anymore. Now, I'm not saying this was a direct result of that, but all of these small contributions that the community plays a part in very actively, proactively, is what contributes. There's war of attrition. You have to grind the whole process down. And I think with a lot of these campaigns, you have to be seen to be serious. I think for a lot of people it's a day out, and what you've got to convince them is, no, I'm sticking around. I'm not just for the day, I think that with campaigns like this, particularly what we were doing, we focused very specifically on small areas of a landscape which people engage with day to day. And we said, this area, you walk through this every day. It's your responsibility to have a think at least as to what you can do to help it.
Question about, obviously political art or campaign art has a long, glorious history, in fact. But do you ever think, as an artist, that there's an element of compromise when you're associating your art with a cause? Or do you think, that's one of the things that art should be about?
Well, let's take, for example, one of the most famous paintings in history, Guernica by Picasso. That was a protest picture. That was a picture about the bombing of an area which he found utterly appalling. And what's that painting doing now? That painting's sitting behind the desk in NATO, and it's become the emblem of anti-war. So if you ask me about, I think some of the greatest paintings ever made were actually to do with protest in some way or other.
Joel, tell me a bit about, I've been fascinated by this right through the interview. I was like, I have to ask a question about this. What exactly is on your lap?
This is one of the handbags that I make, which are to do with protests. And this one particularly is about our St James Gardens in Euston. So when people see me with this bag, they always ask, they say, oh, that's a lovely handbag, or they say, what is that about? It'd be surprised at the people from all walks of life who will sort of see a handbag. You wouldn't expect a man to ask about a handbag, but they do. And that is a great way of spreading a message too, just very subtly.
I've just done it, and I'm glad I did. Now, I understand, obviously, you've chosen your means of communication, your route of protest through art. And very interesting it is too. But how do you mobilise opinion in a liberal democracy? We can see in France, they get yellow vests on and go on riots with the climate emergency. They were willing to stop the traffic. You're engaging through your art. Do you ever ponder, or is it a case of you let 1,000 flowers bloom that try lots of things to engage lots of people?
I think that's the best way. Trying lots of things.
Yeah, and be didactic, get people engaged, we say, in other things which will interest them by diversion, and then suddenly you find yourself with an audience. And that, it does take time, I think. Like we were saying, on this particular cause, we've been at it for 2 years now.
Some of us much
or
longer.
Longer, yeah. I mean, my part of the play is minimal compared to what some people have been every single day having engagement, and that's one person slowly putting their word out. So I think, as with anything, you require an audience to grow. The audience has to feel they are directly contributing or being part of something, of a cause. And that's something which is hard fought. But you have to chip away at the block, and it definitely takes time.
And of course, from my experience, people enjoy protest. For those who haven't engaged in, politics or the politics of protest, that might sound an unusual thing to say, but there's no question that people, if they get engaged in a campaign, that they do all sorts of things they never thought they would do, there's a real camaraderie, and so it's a protest is good for the soul of the protesters. It's better if you can achieve your objectives.
Because I mean, in Sheffield in particular, I witnessed that. I mean, again, I was back and forth there, but every time I'd go back, the number of people would grow who were involved. All of the streets would meet up very regularly. They created new groups of friendships with people which they'd never had before. And suddenly you find the whole community up in arms about this. And this is people creating their own, forging out their own lives because of the campaign, because of the act of protest. And it does bind people. I mean, absolutely it does. And you give people a common cause. come together, and it creates a very strong bond, I think.
Well, Dan, Joe, I can't stop at HS2 for you, but what I can do is present you with the Alex Salmond Quake for appearing on the show. Wonderful. Now, if you pass that one to Joe, Dan, the drill is quite simple. It's whiskey, only Scotch whiskey.
No, not Welsh.
Nothing, well, not even Welsh. In the Quake, and passed round your many friends, whether it's at a performance or watching a work of art, and enjoy the camaraderie. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I've always wanted one of these.
Now you've got one.
Thank you.
As we have seen, in Brexit Britain, the age of mass protest is far from dead. Hundreds of thousands have been on the streets in a variety of protests. The causes have been as varied as the tactics used. The People's Vote was a classic demonstration and show of strength. The climate emergency campaign employed peaceful direct action, while the anti-Trump protest had most success when lampooning the prickly POTUS. A century ago, a mass demonstration in George Square in Glasgow was met with the Riot Act red, tanks at the ready, and talk of martial law. However, is that too far removed from the response to the Gilets jaunes in Paris at the moment? If so, President Macron might reflect that the ringleaders of the Glaswegian demonstrators may have had sore heads on the day a century ago, but many of them ended up being elected to the House of Commons. The police response in the UK is rather more sedate, with Metropolitan Police officers under attack from stuffy establishment newspapers and MPs for fraternising with the entirely peaceful but very disruptive climate emergency campaigners. In a previous show, Alex interviewed the founder of Rock Against Racism, Red Saunders, whose originality in the 1970s set the template for many campaigns that have followed. Protest is more varied in this modern age. Social media has opened up new opportunities, but has also made mass organisation much easier to bolster traditional marches and rallies. However, a one-person protest correctly deployed through the social media can reach an audience denied even the largest demonstration of 50 years ago. In our last programme in this series, we'll draw the contrast between these two approaches. The mass marches currently taking place in favour of Scottish independence, with one of the most adept and courageous single-person protesters of the last generation. Next week, however, we turn to a current political scandal which has received surprisingly little attention: the claim that 1 million people were disenfranchised in the recent European elections in the UK. Join us as we examine whether the right to vote itself is now in jeopardy. Until then, from Alex, myself and all of the team here at the show, it's goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week.